We are honored here to be with Secretary Buttigieg, Department of Transportation, and Amy Cohen, the co-founder of Families for Safe Streets. Today is a day that we're acknowledging the World Day of Remembrance for traffic violence around the world, and very specifically today in the U.S. In the U.S., over 100 of our loved ones perish every day on our roadways. Those are people who don't go home to their loved ones, their families, and their friends. And today we're here to both remember them and also discuss a little bit about this national crisis. And I know Secretary Buttigieg, you have called it that we have on our roadways here in this country. Everyone has a safety story. They have a story about someone that they lost or someone who was injured on our roads. We'd like to change that. Today we're going to get to hear and discuss a little bit about those safety stories and about those folks that we need to remember today. So to start this, I'd love to ask Secretary Buttigieg, do you have a story that you can share with us about why this is so personal to you?
Well, yeah, this is important to me, not just as a policymaker, but as somebody like every American who can close my eyes and picture many people that I knew and cared about who were lost in crashes. If I think about my high school years alone, the kid who sat next to me in study hall my freshman year, and the student who sat in front of me my senior year in Spanish class, both killed in car crashes. And that's just, again, that's just from 4 years of my life. And I think so many Americans have so many stories, so many examples we can think of. That itself may make it a little harder to see the proportions of this problem because it makes us think of this almost as normal. It's something we all grew up with and surrounded by. But now's our chance, I think, not only to honor the lives of those who are lost, but to honor them through action and to insist that this isn't normal, this isn't preventable. The future doesn't have to look like the past. And that's something we work on very hard at this department and something I really appreciate about your work, Amy's work, and the entire advocacy community.
Well, thank you for that. And the day that we are remembering here is about remembrance. It's about then supporting those who've lost loved ones and then acting. And I know, Amy, that's been a big piece of your life. And maybe you could share very quickly your story about your tragedy.
Sure, I'll start with a photo. This was my son. He was 12 years old. He was just trying to get from our home to soccer practice in the park across the street. Just going out to navigate our streets, to go to your sports activity should not be a deadly act. In just a few weeks, he would have turned 22 years old. And he never got to even make it till his 13th birthday. He was bright, curious, funny, kind, lit up a room with that smile. And we miss him every day. After he was killed, I joined with others and helped form Families for Safe Streets because no one should have to be experiencing this heartache. It is unacceptable that as a nation, we are burying over 40,000 children, brothers, sisters, mothers, loved ones, and devastating their communities. Day in, day out, year after year. It can and it must stop.
Well, thank you for all of your support for others, and we are with you here today, ma'am, so thank you for that and for sharing your story and his story. We're here to remember him today. As you've said, it does affect you and it affects those that were in his life, but it also affects our communities. And maybe we could just take a note from each of you of how do you think of this tragedy and this national crisis affecting the communities that we live in? Secretary Buttigieg, any thoughts there?
Well, it's devastating. And again, if there were any other scenario, certainly any other form of transportation, for example, where we were losing 40,000 loved ones, coworkers, friends every year, we would be up in arms. And yet we've gotten bathed in this level of tragedy to where we maybe are too inclined to think of it as normal. It's one of the things that I think we can change. Every time someone loses their life, that is such a blow to an entire community, an entire family. And we can't let it go without saying, even though it's clear as day, because we could be doing more as a country and as a society to make sure that nobody, and no family, no dinner table for that matter, no workplace or sports team has to have an empty place because of a preventable crash.
Thank you for that. Yeah, 46,000 lives from the National Safety Council's data, and I know the DOT also tracks that, it's just unimaginable that we're losing those community members each and every year. Amy, your thoughts on the community and what it means?
You know, I sadly meet with family members from across the country day in and day out who've lost a loved one, and their heartache could fill this room. It is really unimaginable. I literally just left a meeting with Dan Langenkamp, who lost his wife Sarah, not far from here, and buried his young wife. She's a mother with 2 young children that now will grow up without her. It's unconscionable, and we're so grateful for the Secretary for recognizing this crisis and for really fighting for the systematic solutions to save lives, to end the heartache in our communities.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because there has been some change recently. 2 very important pieces of legislation that have come out of this administration regarding policies and ways that we can build safer streets. And Secretary Buttigieg, maybe you can comment on both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the very recent National Roadway Safety Strategy, which is a first of its kind. And I know it incorporates some of the safe systems approaches that we've all been very focused on over the last years, and even the word zero. So maybe I'll give you a chance to talk about those 2 critical pieces of policy.
Thank you. Yes, the National Roadway Safety Strategy is a comprehensive vision for how we can save lives on America's roadways. It recognizes that there's no single player or party, even the federal government, that single-handedly has the power to solve this, but that all of us doing our part together absolutely can. That includes steps that the federal government can and must take, things that we need state and local jurisdictions to do, a call to action to industry, advocacy, community groups, everybody who cares about saving lives. But importantly, while we have that strategy, we're also coupling it with resources. The strategy is based on what we call a safe systems approach, making sure we have, for example, safer drivers, safer speeds, safer vehicles, safer roads that are designed in a safer way, which can be life-saving, and a better standard of post-crash care. But it's one thing to say we ought to be doing these things. It's another to have resources to help make them happen. And that's why this roadway safety strategy couldn't be coming at a better time. We are also in the middle of a historic level of infrastructure investment under this president's leadership. That infrastructure package that moved through Congress almost exactly a year ago creates resources the likes of which we haven't seen in my lifetime, many of which are going to things like new or improved roads. And so how we design them, how those dollars are spent, is hugely consequential. It includes a dedicated fund for safe roads and streets for all, a way for communities to apply for grants for projects they think will make their communities safer. Anything from redesigning a roadway entirely to maybe a simpler, smaller enhancement like a well-placed roundabout or even crosswalk that could very well save lives. And we're going through the applications right now for the first $1 billion that will go out. But I would also say for the more than $100 billion that will go out through formulas to the states to do their highway and road building, every penny of that should be influenced by the awareness that good design saves lives.
Yeah, it is remarkable how much safety is in that Infrastructure Act. And a lot of folks won't realize that, as you've said, as we revitalize our nation, the intent is to do that in a safer way, in a way that truly brings safety to our streets and safety to our communities. So thank you for that. It will be game changing for our nation.
We think so.
You. One of the things that is noted within the both the safety strategy and in the Infrastructure Act is that not everyone is kept equally safe on our roadways. There's quite a bit of discussion in the safety strategy about persons of color and others in rural rural communities in our nation that aren't as equally safe, and the data is pretty stark regarding the disparities there. Any comments on what it is we need to do to make sure that truly everybody gets to move around our nation, no matter who they are, in a safe and equitable way?
Well, it should give all of us pause that we have not only an unacceptable high level of death and injury on our roadways, but that there are clear and dramatic racial and regional differences in those outcomes. So while they're high for the entire country, they are even higher for certainly Black, brown, tribal, and rural residents, both as pedestrians and as vehicle drivers or occupants. And so it reflects some of the importance of getting these investments right. For example, often Americans of color, lower income Americans, and rural Americans or more likely to live in an area where there might not be a good sidewalk, a safe sidewalk, or any sidewalk along a route that they have to walk as pedestrians. Or there could be a good half a mile between places you can safely cross a street. That is sometimes a direct result of the way that a past generation of infrastructure investment worked. Who got the safer, better designs and who didn't. We can do something about that. Another example I would point to is the reason why it's so important that we set rules and requirements about safety features and equipment in cars. Because you see a lot of safety features that exist if you buy the top of the line car with all the bells and whistles, but not the base model. What that effectively means is that if you have a higher income and you can afford that fancier car, you're more likely to survive a crash. So there are certain things that we need to make sure by rule are present in every car, so that if you're acquiring a vehicle, whether you're paying for the top of the line or the most affordable version you can get, you know that you're going to have that protection.
Yeah, so important. Amy, I don't know if you have some thoughts on vehicle design, but we know that what we do in the US here is a little different than actually some other countries in what they require for safety in their vehicles. And I know, Amy, you've got some thoughts here you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, just how we rank as a nation compared to other high-income nations is abysmal. We're at the bottom of the list. And we know that if you build your roads with safety as a priority, you design your vehicles, as you said, where everybody gets the safety features, not just those who can afford it, then you get the outcomes that we are looking for. Instead, we're building roads and cars in a way that is basically writing the death sentence for thousands of people every year. If only we had the same performing rate of those other high-income nations, 20 to 30,000 people like my son would still be alive every year, year after year. So we can and we must do better, and we are here as advocates to be the wind at your sail and to push back on those who don't recognize that safety should come first.
Yeah, on this day of remembrance, we know that 1.3 million souls are lost across the globe to traffic violence. And it's not actually equal there either. Low-income countries actually bear much more of that burden. But as Amy just said, even for the industrial nations around the world, we're not doing so well there as the US. We're about, I think it's 74 out of 47 out of 54. Thank you, Amy. That's a wake-up call, and that's something we can do something about. So I'm glad that these policy statements and this new legislation really is focusing on safety, because we can get back in the leadership position that we've enjoyed on our roads in the past regarding being the safe nation to drive. And sir, if you'd like to just share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, part of our self-image as a country is that we're supposed to be the best at everything. We want to be leading the way. We're the country that brought, for example, the automotive revolution to the world in the first place. And yet we lag behind, badly behind, as Amy pointed out, when it comes to safety outcomes. And I'm not sure there's a lot of awareness about this, actually. I think most Americans are at least conscious, for example, that there's a big disparity between the US and other developed countries in an area like gun violence. How many of those same Americans realize that similar proportions are true when it comes to traffic safety? You look at Canada even, right here in North America, with similar proportions in their roads and cars, and much better safety outcomes. That tells us something. And I think that tells us that we can and must expect better of ourselves. And that starts with the policy choices we make, but it's up to everybody from a federal regulator to an ordinary driver or pedestrian to be part of that solution.
Yeah, another disparity that we saw was actually during the pandemic, which is also something to just kind of take on board and figure out if we can understand what was going on in the US. We had for 30 years been bringing traffic fatalities in our nation down. And during the pandemic, something happened where whatever was working before to help us get our roads to be safer and less people to perish kind of went out the window. And our death rate in the last year or so is like going all the way back to 2005. And so there's also something to look at there. What happened to us? Why did we behave differently on our roadways? What did our roads not do for us to keep us safe during the pandemic? And that's another place where, again, other industrial nations didn't quite see that dynamic. So, sir or Amy, any advice as to what do we do now that we're hopefully on the other side of all of this disruption to make sure we get back to safe roadways?
We're getting the crisis that we are building We have not historically invested in safe roadway design and safe vehicles the way our other high-income nations have. And so COVID did just not impact them the same way. And families, like mine, have paid the highest price for society's failure to act. So we are thrilled that we are finally making the investments that are long overdue. We need regulations to make sure that everybody gets those safety vehicle features in vehicles. We have to stop allowing vehicles to get bigger and bigger and killing people on our roads. We need to put in place the safe systems approach, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, to end this crisis and to be the leader once again to the world on roadway safety.
And as you've said, it's a system. It's all of those pieces that have to go together. And sir, that is, I think, what's in both the safety strategy and in the Infrastructure Act. Maybe you can comment on what you think the future holds for us.
Well, look, I think we can move toward a future where it is puzzling, even quaint to future historians, that we could have experienced or tolerated the level of roadway deaths that are routine right now in the United States. I believe we'll live to see that future, but it depends on the choices we make right now. And that does require a paradigm shift. First of all, about the scale of the problem, which is staring us in the face, but sometimes precisely because we're all so close to it, maybe a little bit hard to see. And it means making the right kinds of choices. We now know things that make a big difference in terms of the safety of drivers, passengers, and those outside the vehicle. We're adopting new paradigms, including realizing and recognizing that the qualities of the vehicle itself should be held to a high standard for those outside as well as inside the vehicle in terms of their safety outcomes. It means making sure that we're ready to expend financial and, where necessary, political capital to get this done, because it's hard to think of a higher calling than saving lives.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And words matter, and you both are very passionate about this issue and helping folks understand it, one, because you're right, it's right in front of us and sometimes we can't see it, but also to make sure that we're using the right vocabulary. And the both of you have used words today like crash and traffic violence, I'm sure very purposefully. And I know a lot of folks sometimes use the word accident when we talk about something that happens on our road that might either hurt or perhaps lose a life. And we're very careful, I know you are very careful not to use that word. Maybe just share a little bit why words matter, not just what we're talking about, but how we use our words to help folks understand this crisis.
Well, I think the way we talk about these things drives the way we think about them, and therefore the choices that we make. And I don't want to drift into any kind of vocabulary that makes it seem like this level of danger and death on our roadway is unavoidable or inescapable. A crash happens because of preventable factors that we can do something about, which leads me to another word that I think is important for us to use in this context, which is zero. That's a hard thing for a lot of people to get on board with, the idea that it's anything but a far-off aspirational goal to imagine zero deaths from traffic crashes and zero loss of life. But let's step back and think about it. First of all, let's think about the number of airliner deaths last year. Number of jetliner deaths last year in U.S. commercial aviation, zero. And that didn't just happen. I'm sure if I were proposing in the 50s that we'd get to a day where we could see that, people would have looked at me condescendingly or worse. And yet we found a way to get it done through a very effective and intense safety culture in the way that we handle our national aviation system. To take a different example, I suppose if I were to say to a room full of people in the middle of the 19th century that we could get to where there were zero deaths among anybody we know personally from cholera, that might have been considered laughable. Now, the reverse would be considered alarming. And so it starts with naming our goals and then looking at how we get there. And sure enough, zero has been achieved, not at a major national level, but in big cities, including abroad, cities of more than 500,000 people, and in American cities of more than 10,000 people. So what I want to do is add to the list of places that have achieved it and keep that going.
Yeah, thank you for that. And unless you set the target and set the expectation that zero is achievable and use that language, sometimes folks can never quite get their thoughts and their actions to go around that. So thank you for that, just like in the airline transportation business. Amy, any thoughts on language, especially around this issue of accident and crash?
Yeah, I mean, my son did not die in an accident. Sadly, his death was predictable and preventable. And by changing language, we are starting to recognize that we have a problem we can fix. As you said, there is so much complacency about this crisis. You know, it is the equivalent of a plane crashing every single day, day after day after day. And if that was the airline industry, we would all be up in arms. But because it happens one here and one there, we've lost sight of this crisis that is right in front of us. And by changing language, we're really reinforcing the statement that this is something we can and we must fix.
Yeah, we were really excited to see zero as language that's in the National Roadway Safety Strategy. And that for a lot of folks was really a wake-up call, and really appreciate that the department has taken that on. The Road to Zero Coalition is 1,700 organizations that have been binding together to say, how do we get to zero? What do we need to do? And so much of what's in the safety strategy is based on some of the recommendations that have come from that organization that was started with the Department of Transportation and the National Safety Council. So again, thank you for your predecessors of leaning into that. It's going to take us all, and it's going to take multiple organizations, both private, public, community, local, federal level, for us to make these changes. Very recently, the National Safety Council, with support from the Department of Transportation, has put out some grants that help communities find best practices and put those into practice, not only to help with safety, but also to address this issue of equity. And we're really appreciative of those grants and the partnership with the Department of Transportation. Those are going to save lives and hopefully bring us practices that we can bring to other communities so that they can also adopt those. So maybe I'll ask a question there. When we think about communities and what they can do and advocacy at the local level, maybe I'll start with you, Amy, and say, what do you hope folks take away from this? Not only the World Day of Remembrance, but also your thoughts and the Secretary's thoughts about what they can do to help. What can they do? What action can they take?
I mean, we need everyone to join in this fight. Our mission in Families for Safe Streets is to confront the preventable epidemic of traffic violence. And we chose that word confront very intentionally. It will take people to join with us and push back on the complacency and to demand the systematic solutions, like building roads that prioritize safety over speed and ensuring that our vehicles, all the safety features are available for everyone. And so we encourage everyone to join with us to support those leaders who are supportive of safety and are prioritizing safety, and to push back on those who aren't at the city, state, and federal levels to make sure that traffic violence comes to an end and that we achieve the goals of Vision Zero.
Thank you, Amy. And so what about you? What's your call to action for local and federal-related organizations and individuals?
Well, it's that every piece is connected, every step matters, and every choice has something to do with safety. You just have to see it that way. And so the truth is, while I'm proud of the extraordinary work that's been done in this department and with our national partners on everything from vehicle design to the way we imagine our roadways, many of the most important decisions are actually made closer to home. Often there are knockdown, drag-out local fights over something like adjusting the way that an important street or road works so that it might be a little bit slower and a whole lot safer. Things like that make a big difference in terms of safety outcomes. And so what I would urge everyone to do, whether you are a professional in industry or policy, or whether you're just a community member or a citizen, maybe partly on this Day of Remembrance, thinking about how to honor with action somebody that you know or have lost, to look for areas where you can make a difference and take it as a personal responsibility, because while no one person alone can achieve this, all of us together absolutely can, and we have to.
And we have to, thank you. And for everyone, they all have a story, as we started with both of your stories. I'll give you my story. My brother-in-law recently was a roadside assistance in New Hampshire, and his truck was rear-ended. And as a result of that, he did not lose his life. Thankfully, he was a lucky one, but he was out of work for a year and a half, and it truly did impact his whole family. Everyone has that story. You've shared yours from high school and from your son, Amy, just so tragic. All of them are painful, whether it's an injury or a death. They impact those that we love in our community. And this Day of Remembrance is so important for us all, as you've said, sir, and challenged us to act. The best way to remember them is to go help us make change. So maybe that is how we'll end this, and I'll give you each a chance just to give your final thoughts. I'll end with you, sir, but I'll start with Amy. What's your final thoughts for the world listening to us today about what we can do and how we best can remember those that we've lost?
The World Day of Remembrance is international theme. It is an international event. It was started 25 years ago and is sanctioned by the United Nations and has been happening and growing here in the United States for a few years now. The theme is to remember those who've been personally impacted, the thousands who die every year, the millions who suffer life-altering injuries, to support those personally impacted and to act in their name so that no one else has to experience this loss. So we are here supporting this call to action for World Day of Remembrance, and we are grateful to be sitting next to you, and I look forward to the day when I can stand next to you as we've achieved Division Zero here in the United States.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for the steps that you have taken to prevent others from living through the tragedy that you have. Thank you, Lorraine, for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And for us, the bottom line is that we can and must save lives, not knowing the names of everybody who will be at that dinner table where they belong, at that soccer practice where they belong, at that workplace where they belong, because we did something right here, right now, when we had the chance to make it safer to be a passenger, a driver, or a pedestrian in this country. How could we not take that action? And none of us knows whether the life that we might be able to save could even be our own. So as we pause to honor the lives that have been lost, to tell their stories, to remember their faces, to picture what they brought to our lives, we also know that we can tell a very different story for the future with less pain, less loss, and a lot to be proud of.
Thank you. And there is a lot to be proud of and a lot more work to do. And we have two leaders with us here today. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg and Amy, from co-founder of our Families for Safe Streets. These are two leaders. We need many more. We need everyone, as we've heard today. It will be a systemic action that we need in order to make our roadways safer so that no one has to lose their life. We remember all that have, and we look forward to a day when we do not have to have that remembrance. But today we do, and thank you for joining us.